We start our show with breaking news. San Antonio Spurs star Victor Wembanyama will be out for the remainder of the season after being diagnosed with deep vein thrombosis, which is a blood clot in his right shoulder. Wembanyama, the 2024 Rookie of the Year, he's had several notable performances this year, including a 5x5 game, 10-block game, a 50-point game, and he had the Spurs fighting for a play-in spot. Shams Charania, our senior insider, joins us now. Shams, this diagnosis, it was shocking. We just saw Victor play in the All-Star game. What happened between that game Sunday and now?
Malik, I'm told that Victor Wembanyama had started to feel symptomatic, and he went into the post-All-Star break Monday, Tuesday, taking time for himself, taking downtime, and hoped to feel better, but he did not. He was still feeling symptomatic from my understanding, and that's when the Spurs and when Wembanyama started to administer a battery of tests over the last 24 to 48 hours that found this blood clot in his right shoulder, and the sides are now going to huddle on treatment plans and options for a player who's just 21 years old and an ascending star.
Yeah, a really scary diagnosis here. And of course, Shams, there's a history of players in the NBA coming back from blood clots. But what do we know about the timeline for Victor's recovery here?
Malik, I'm told that the San Antonio Spurs fully believe that Wembanyama will make a complete recovery for the 2025-26 season. I'm told that they don't have any long-term concerns, and they believe this is an isolated clot in his right shoulder, that deep vein thrombosis diagnosis, as they called it. And Brandon Ingram in March 2019 had the same diagnosis in his right shoulder. He had a procedure about a week later, and he took him several months to recover from that. And from that point on, he started basketball in the off season, and then he was an all-star. A one-time all-star he is, and that all-star season came in 2019, 2020 with the Pelicans, so the following season. So there is some example here of a player recently in 2019-20 that has made a full recovery from this in Brandon Ingram.
Yeah, you look at Brandon Ingram, maybe Asar Thompson and his recovery from that. Brandon Ingram missed the final 19 games of that season, and then he was able to come back and become an all-star. So we're hopeful that it will be a similar case here for Victor Wembanyama. Shams, thank you. We'll be back to you later in the show. Right now, though, here's Chris Paul reacting to the Wembanyama news.
And it's been extremely tough, to tell you to say the least, you know, especially with this organization and how they put everything into perspective, you know. So obviously the Pop situation, knowing what he means to the league, Vic, and you know, him playing his first All-Star game, I think for us, you know we got a job to do, but just like anybody, we worry about our people.
Brian Windhorst, Shanae Agumake, Danny Green join me now as we continue to react to the news that Victor Wembanyama will be sidelined for the rest of the regular season with a deep vein thrombosis in his shoulder. It's going to be referred to as a blood clot. You'll also hear it referred to as DVT. But Brian, you've covered players who've been diagnosed with this before. What are the next steps here for Wemby and for the San Antonio Spurs?
Yeah, I've also myself had a blood clot about 15 years ago. And so, you know, the first thing you have to do immediately is to get on anticoagulant medication, basically blood thinners, to make sure that you're safe. That's will be step one, absolutely. And that's why Victor Wembanyama's season is over. No matter how they decide to ultimately treat it, right, once you get on blood thinners, you're really limited for a while in what you can do in terms of physical activity. You just have to protect yourself. And so that's what is common. And then they look for the cause of it. And while most blood clots, and we even see most athlete blood clots, come from the legs, and that was the case for Asar Thompson last year with the Pistons, this one, based on what the Spurs have told us, is that it comes from the arm. Like Shams said with Brandon Ingram, there is incidences of young athletes, especially in repetitive motion sports like basketball, where you're shooting a lot, that you can develop a clot in your arm and shoulder. And so this is very unfortunate. As you heard Chris Paul there, you know, in talking to people in San Antonio today, they described how difficult this season has been with all these traumatic events. Greg Popovich suffering a stroke, now Victor Wembanyama with the blood clot. Not that it's the same because it's not medical, but the midseason trade for De'Aaron Fox, it's not something the Spurs normally do, is make major in-season trades. Yeah. They've had a lot of things that have upset everything this year. So they're sort of dealing with it and processing as a team, but it's been a very rough season, and it's probably going to, have lasting effects the rest of the way for them.
Right. There's so many layers to this that we will get through throughout the course of the show. But Danny, just as a player, your reaction when you hear that this young star has been diagnosed with a blood clot?
I mean, first and foremost, I was concerned for his health and well-being.
Absolutely.
As a teammate, you're like worried because it's a serious issue. You just never know how this can go. You hope it's a singular thing and it doesn't continue on, because we've seen things happen like Wendy said about Chris Bosh in the past. And I'm glad Wendy's all right and he's still here with us healthy. But you worry about him as an individual. As a group, it's tough, especially with Chris Ball. We don't know how many more years he has left to play. We don't know if he's coming back to San Antonio next year. De'Aaron Fox came here to be a great duo with Wemby. It hits that, on a different aspect. But for the younger players, it gives them opportunity to grow a little bit more. But playing tournament, that type of scenario for them is very tough to get to without him. I don't see them winning or being in the playoffs this year, but they will get some growth from the other guys. But this is a tough hit overall from an organizational standpoint.
Yeah, Danny, we've been in locker rooms, and to be honest, when you hear situations like this, it's incredibly rare, and it's very scary for players because we know that this has real-life implications. It's not a rolled ankle. It's not even a torn ligament.
Yeah.
This is something that is scary for not only athletes, but also people walking around in real life. And, as you mentioned, for the San Antonio Spurs, it just is difficult because they had a lot of good momentum going on the court, especially after the first 20 or so games. And Victor was the centerpiece of all of that. I mean, he leads the team in scoring, leads the team in rebounding. He's number one, and he was 19 games away from being Defensive Player of the Year, reaching that 65-point mark where he was a heavy favorite. So, yes, you wish him the best with his health. And there are pathways that he can look to and say, hey, I can get back and be an all-star and be the face of the NBA, because he was emerging to be just that. So it is a roadblock, and it's tough to see. But I do wish him the best, and I'm glad that the Spurs, they have a family system to be able to navigate these situations.
Definitely a great place to be to recover.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And you know that, Danny,
yes, I do.
Firsthand. I think it's important to reiterate what Shams just reported, which is that the Spurs they expect this to be an isolated incident. So in the case of a player like Chris Bosh that you brought up, it was something that he had to contend with several different times, and that's what ended up being a larger issue, as opposed to someone like Asar Thompson or like Brandon Ingram, Brian, where it was a one-off. That is what the San Antonio Spurs are hoping. What have you heard on that front, Brian?
Yeah, so speaking incredibly generally,
yes.
Malika, when you have a blood clot one time, you get it treated. There's great success rate with this to clear it, especially if you catch it early, and then you move on with your life. And if you have another clot, especially if it doesn't come from a direct incident, then essentially you face the reality of potentially being on blood thinners the rest of your life to protect you. And so that's the difference. What you're hoping for is that this is just a one-off event. And knowing Victor just a little bit over the last couple of years, I can only imagine how hard he took this news, because he's such a competitor. He hates to go a day without playing and improving his game. The idea that he's going to be restricted for 6 months is going to drive him crazy. And I'm sure he was looking forward to this game tonight. It's in Austin. It's against the Spurs. Yeah, it's a sort of a Kevin Durant return to the University of Texas game, but it was a game against a team that is right next to them in the standings they're trying to pass.
Right.
So I'm sure Victor is extremely frustrated just with his own situation, more than worried about anything else.
Yeah, and Danny, that was my biggest takeaway, Wendy, as well. Like, being away from the game for that extended amount of time. Normally, when you have injuries, there's like a pathway that you think, okay, like I can walk here, I can do that. This is such a unique circumstance for someone who is so competitive and values each and every possession. So I know it's going to be hard.
It's going to be very tough. I feel for him, but it's necessary. This is a serious issue. Like Wendy said, take the proper steps. He's in the right place. He has the right recovery group around him.
Yeah.
I think he'll be fine.
And just sort of projecting for the next few months for a team without Victor Wembanyama. I mean, they were knocking on the door of the play-in.
Right.
But now that changes. But that doesn't mean that next season, hopefully everybody healthy, they'll be right back where they hope to be.
Right. And this is a diagnosis that's not, like you said, like a rolled ankle or something that we see often. We have seen it before in the NBA, but it's not something that we see all the time. So I do want to bring in our injury analyst, Stefania Bell, to help us understand this diagnosis just a little bit more. Stefania, can we just take a step back here? What exactly is a deep vein thrombosis, and how does it happen?
You know, medicine has a funny way of making things sound more complicated, but basically a thrombosis is a clot, and it's a clot in a vein. Deep vein thrombosis, commonly the abbreviation is DVT, and they can occur for a number of reasons. You know, sometimes there's a traumatic event that precipitates a clot. Sometimes it's immobilization. If you think about sometimes patients who go in for total knee replacements might be on blood thinners in advance, or prophylactic things to help prevent blood clots, because after immobilization, there's a risk of blood clot. And sometimes there's a genetic factor for a clotting disorder, but that would be highly unlikely in a high-performance athlete like Wembanyama. Usually when we see this kind of a thing, a deep vein thrombosis or a clot in the shoulder, in an upper extremity, it's related to what we call thoracic outlet syndrome, where there's compression of a rib over vein. It can be a compression of a vein or a nerve as it exits from near the neck and through the shoulder and supplies the arm. So we do see these in athletes and in young athletes, but mostly overhead athletes. Not as common in basketball, but it can occur.
Just real quick, Stefania, before we let you go, you said in young athletes. Is there any correlation, you know, I've seen this question floated out there, either with the size of a person like Victor Wembanyama or with the age of a player here?
Not necessarily.
Okay.
You know, it's funny because in throwers, like baseball pitchers, where we see this a lot, they will say that they've been throwing fine for years and never had an issue, and then suddenly one develops. So we can't always predict when they're going to occur, but the important thing is that with proper treatment, whether that's blood thinners, whether it's a procedure to a thrombolysis to lyse the clot, or even if there's ultimately a rib resection, if in fact it's related to thoracic outlet syndrome, the prognosis is excellent. And there's an excellent return to high peak performance like they had pre-injury.
Okay, that is very good news. Again, in line with what our Shams Charania is reporting, which is that the Spurs see this as an isolated incident, and they are hopeful that he is going to make a full recovery here. Stefania Bell, thank you so very much for stopping by NBA Today. We will continue to cover this story through the course of our show. Also coming up right here, the King, he turned back.